continue our lessons, the Neuroanatomy Elementary Introduction Part 2. I'm from Department of Neurosurgery, Qilu Hospital, Shandong University. The diencephalon is a smaller part of the brain that's mostly hidden from the view when we are looking at the outside of the brain. It is divided into four parts: the epithalamus, thalamus, subthalamus, and the hypothalamus. The diencephalon can be found just above the brainstem between the cerebral hemisphere. It forms the wall of the third ventricle. The only part of the diencephalon that can be seen without taking the cross section of the brain is in the bottom and most portion of the hypothalamus. A portion of subthalamus is made up of tissue from the midbrain extending into the diencephalon. Thus, parts of the midbrain regions like the subtenerior nigra and red nucleus are found in the diencephalon. The subthalamus is also home of the subthalamic nuclei and the zone intacta. The subthalamic nuclei is distally interconnected with the basal ganglia and play a role of the modulating movement. The zone incerta has many connections throughout the cortex and the spinal cord, but its function is still not determined. Several collections of important fibers also pass through the subthalamus. The thalami most frequently referred with the singular thalamus, consisting of the overall collection of nuclei and make up most of the mass of the diencephalon. The thalamus is often described as a relay station because almost all sensory information, within the exception of smell, that processed to the cortex first stopped in the thalamus before being sent on its destination. The structure is subdivided into a number of nuclei that processes a function specialized for the dealing with a particular part of the information. Sensory information thus travel to the thalamus is routed in a nuclei tailored to dealing with the data. Then the information is sent from the nuclei to appropriate area, the cortex, where it is further processed. The thalamus doesn't deal just with the sensory information. However, it also receives a great deal of information from the cerebral cortex, and it is involved with the processing that the information and sending it back to other areas of the brain. Due to its involvement in this complex network, the thalamus plays a number of important functions ranging from sleep to the consciousness. The hypothalamus is a small, about the size just like an almond, region located directly up above the brainstem. It's also made up collection of nuclei that is involved in a variety of functions. The hypothalamus is often linked, however, to main roles: maintaining the homeostasis and regulating hormone release. Homeostasis is the maintenance of equilibrium in the system like the human body. Optimal biological function is facilitated by keeping things like body temperature, body blood pressure, and caloric intake expenditure at a fair consistent level. The hypothalamus receives a steady stream of information about these types of factors. When it recognizes an anti-precipitate imbalance, it enacts a mechanism to reverse the disparities. The hypothalamus acts the main homeostasis and influences behaviors in general by regulating the hormone secretion. This is particularly done through the control of hormone release from the particular gland. Though this mechanism, the hypothalamus, has a widespread effect on the body and behavior. It is often said that the hypothalamus is responsible for the 4 F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and fornications. Clear, due to the frequency and the significance of this behavior, the hypothalamus is extremely important in everybody's life. The brainstem is the region of the brain that connected the cerebellum with the spinal cord. It consists of midbrain, medulla oblongata, and the pons. Motor sensory neurons travel through the brainstem, allow the earlier signals between the brain and the spinal cord. Most cranial nerves are found in the brainstem. The brainstem coordinates the motor control signal sent from the brain to the body. The brain region also controls the life-supporting automatic functions, the peripheral nervous system. The cerebral ventricle is located in the brainstem, posterior to the pons and medulla oblongata. The cerebrospinal fluid filled the ventricle is continuous with the cerebral aqueduct and the central cranial spinal cord. The cerebellum is another part of the hidden brain that lies within the posterior cranial fossa, inferior to the occipital lobe and dorsal to the brainstem. It consists of 3 lobes. The 3 lobes is the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flexiocular lobe. This picture is the posterior lobe of cerebellum and the microscope. When we do some neurosurgeries, we need to expose this part of the cerebellum. After we check the cerebellum, we can see the lesion and remove the lesion. And this picture shows the posterior lobe of cerebellum. Functionally, the cerebellum is divided into 3 zones: the cerebellum, the lateral zone, which receives sensory information from the cerebral cortex and is responsible for the planning of movements and that are just about the ocular motor planning. The spinal cerebellum, the worms, and the intermediate zone, which receives the proximative information from the dorsal columns of spinal cord, is responsible for the coordinates of movement, which we also call the motor execution. Occiput, which receives the information from the vestibular nuclei and visual cortex, is responsible for balance and ocular movement. The cerebellar cortex transmits the information received from the 3 afferents. For example, the cerebellum, spinal cord, the vestibular nuclei, to the 4 cerebellar nuclei: dental, emboliform, globicus, and the fastigial. Within the inner white matter, the cerebellar nuclei sends the afferent impulse to the thalamus, red nucleus, reticular information to execute the cerebellar function. The cerebral tact travel through the cerebellum ponticles. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which is 8 pairs of cervical nerves and 12 pairs of thoracic nerves and 5 lumbar nerves and 5 sacral nerves and 1 occipital nerve. The spinal cord has enlargement in the cerebral region and the lumbosacral region to handle the security of arms and legs. And the vascular nerve also is divided into vascular sensory nerve and vascular motor nerve. And the vascular motor nerve also has 2 parts. The first one is the sympathetic part and the parasympathetic part. Here is the 12 pairs of cranial nerve. The first one is olfactory nerve, who controls the sense of smell. The second one is optic nerve, who controls the vision. The third one is oculomotor nerve, who controls the eye movement. The fourth one is the trochlear nerve, controls the eye movement. The mainly is the intrusion downwards gaze. The fifth cranial nerve is the trigeminal nerve. It controls the somatic sensation from the face and the mouth and cornea. And the sixth cranial nerve is abducens nerve. It controls the eye movement. The mainly is abundance or lateral movement. And the seventh cranial nerve is the facial nerve. It controls the muscle of the facial expression, taste from the anterior tongue. And the eighth one, the cranial nerve, is vestibular trochlear nerve. It controls the hearing, the sensation of the balance. And the ninth one is the glossophageal nerve, which controls the sensation from the posterior tongue and pharynx, and the taste from the posterior tongue, carotid bile receptor and chemoreceptor. The ninth is the vagus nerve, which controls the automatic function of gut and the sensation from the larynx and the pharynx, and the muscle of vocal cords and swelling. And the 11th is the spinal nasally nerve, which controls the shoulder and the neck muscles. And the 12th is the hypoglossal nerve, which controls the movement of tongues. Also, we can see the cranial nerves during our operation. In this picture, we can see the outside nerve is the eighth facial nerve, and the inside nerve is the fifth, the trigeminal nerve. In other pictures, we can also see the vagus nerve and the ninth cranial nerve. This nerve, we can see it very clear under the endoscope. The major division of the peripheral nervous system and the spinal nerves has 31 pairs, the 8 cervical pairs and 12 thoracic pairs and 5 lumbar pairs and 5 sacral pairs and 1 occipital pairs. The spinal cord has an enlargement in the cervical region and the lumbosacral region to handle the security of arms and legs. The vascular nerves has two parts, the vascular sensory nerve and vascular motor nerve. The vascular sensory nerve has only one kind of nerve, and the vascular motor nerve has two parts, is the sympathetic part and the parasympathetic part. The sympathetic part of nervous system, division of the nervous system that functions to produce the localized adjustment such as swelling as a response to an increased temperature and reflex adjustment to the cardiovascular system. Under conditions of stress, the entire sympathetic nervous system is activated. Production immediate widespread response called the fight-to-flight response. This response is characterized by the release of large quantity of epinephrine from the adrenal, increase the heart rate, increase the cardiac outputs, skeletal muscle, vasodilations, contentimers, and the gastrointestinal vasoconstrictions, and the pituitary dilation, bronchial dilation, and the pituitary section. And the overall effect is prepare individual for immediately danger. The parasympathetic nerve system division of the nervous system that primarily modulates the vascular organs such as glands. The parasympathetic system is one of two agonistic sets of the nerve and the automatic nervous system. The other side of comprise the sympathetic nervous system, while providing important control of many tissue. The parasympathetic system is not crucial for the maintenance of the life, unlike the sympathetic system, which activates the so-called the flight-to-flight response. The nerve fibers of the parasympathetic nerve system are crucial nerve, primarily the vagus nerve and the lumbar spinal nerve. When stimulated, these nerves increase the digestive secretion and reduce the heartbeat. The corticospinal or pyramidal tract is a major motor tract that controls the voluntary movement of skeletal muscle, especially skilled movements of distal muscle of the limbs. All structures from the cerebral cortex to the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord constitute the upper portion of the system, which we call the upper motor neurons. The anterior horn cells and their associated the axon consisting of the lower portion of the system. We call it lower motor neuron. The cerebellum plays an important role in coordinating movement. It receives sensory information and then influences descending motor pathways to produce fine, smooth, and coordinated motion. The cerebellum is divided into three general areas: the achin-cerebellum, also called the vestibular cerebellum, and the paleocerebellum, also called the spinal cerebellum, and the neurocerebellum, also called the cerebral cerebellum. The achin-cerebellum is primarily involved in the controlling posture and balance, as well as the movement of head and eyes. It receives afferent signals from the vestibular part and then sends the afferent fibers to the appropriate descending motor pathway. The paleocerebellum primarily controls the movement of a proximal portion of the limb. It receives sensory information on limb position and muscle tone and then modifies and coordinates this movement through the afferent pathway to the appropriate descending motor pathway. The neurocerebellum is the largest portion of the cerebellum, and it coordinates the movement of distal portion of limb, and it receives input the cerebral cortex and thus help it in planning the motor activity and sending a pencil and then planning and executing the movement to the arm and hand to pick it up. Pain, temperature, and pressure sensation below the head ultimately are conveyed to the primary somatosensory cortex, which we call the posterior gyrus, by the anterior lateral system, which we call the spinothalamic and spinoracular tract. The facialis gracilis and the continence of the spinal laminical system record the proprioception, vibratory, and tactile sensation to the thalamus. Also the ventricle posterior mass nuclei, whereas the lateral conveyor system made it some tough, vibratory, and perceptive sensation. In the picture, we can see the blue and the purple lines show these dual pathways. Ultimately, these fibers are sending as a parallel pathway to the thalamus, synapse, and extending to the cortex. The nerve cells bodies for touch, pressure, pain, temperature in the head, in the trigeminal similarly ganglia of the trigeminal nerve. In the picture, we can see the blue and red lines in this figure. The neuron cells body mediate the proprioception resident in the mesencephalic nuclei of the fifth cranial nerve. Most of related neurons are projected to the contralateral VPM nuclei of the thalamus, and this to the postcentral gyros of the cerebral cortex, where they are somatic topically represented. The retina has two types of the photoreceptors. The cones are mediate the color vision, the rods are mediate the light perception, but with low acuity. The greatest acuity is found in the region of the macula of the retina, where only cones are found in the upper left pedal. The visual signals are conveyed by a ganglion cells whose axon consists in the optical nerve. The visual signals from the nasal retina cross the occipital chiasm, while information from the temporal retina remains in the epilateral optic tract. The fibers snaps in the lateral geniculate nuclei, which we call the visual field, is topographically represented here and inverted, and the signals are conveyed to the visual cortex, is made the surface occipital lobe. The cochlear transduces sound into the electrical signals. The axon conveys these signals to the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei, where it is tonotopically organized. Following a sensory of the integrated relay pathway, the ascending pathway projects to the thalamus, which we call the medium ganglia bodies, and then the acoustic cortex in the transverse gyros in the temporal lobe, where information is topically represented. The last topic is reflex and reflex up. Reflex is a reaction of the organism of the viral system by the viral system in response to the stimulus. The reflex arc has 5 basic components. The first one is the receptor, and the second one is the sensor neurons to the CNS and to the motor neurons, and last to the effector. Okay, that's all our neuroanatomy lessons. Thank you very much.